very good morning to you. Well, in our adventures following the life of David, we are fast approaching the moment of transition when Saul dies and David becomes king. But before we get there, we have to look at the story of a little place called Ziklag, Ziklag, first mentioned in 1 Samuel 27 verse 5. David had fled. He'd spent a lot of time hiding in various places of the land, and Saul kept finding him and chasing him and making life difficult for him. So he eventually decides to move with his men into the Philistine territory and settle there. Now he's got a bit of a problem because he's known by the Philistines as being a great champion, and after all, their memories weren't that short that they couldn't remember Goliath and the great defeat of the Philistines at David's hand. So David persuaded the king, Achish, Achish, I don't know how to pronounce it. I've always pronounced it Achish in 1 Samuel 27:5. He persuades him to let him settle, not in his capital where he'd been living, but in a town with his men and their household. Because it says in verse 3, David dwelt with Achish at Gath, which was their capital, and he and his men, every man with his household, and David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. So the men had accumulated over their time their own wives and had children, and they needed a more permanent sort of place to be rather than roaming as they had been at the beginning of David's fleeing from Saul. So much time had passed, and we don't get that idea of the amount of time, but it does tell us in verse 7 that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines for 1 year and 4 months. So he settled there in Ziklag, which if you get a chance to look it up, either in a good Bible dictionary or on Google it, Ziklag in the Old Testament, and see where it was. It was the Philistines had territory along the coast at the southwest part of the land of Palestine, and Ziklag is inland a bit, almost in the land of Judah, the area of the tribe of Judah. But so it was quite close to Saul's territory, but it was technically and sort of politically in the territory of the Philistines. And Achish gives him Ziklag, and he settles there with his men and his wives and his children. And we're going to be looking at the chapter about Ziklag fairly soon, because it's a most wonderful chapter, chapter 30. One of my favourite chapters in the whole Bible. Oh, I love it for lots of reasons. Anyway, so David settles in Ziklag, and the end of that chapter tells us how he made raids on various other enemies of Israel, enemies of his people. He made raids against them, but he made sure that he destroyed everything so that word couldn't go back to Achish that he was fighting against the enemies of the Israelites, because Achish thought he was on his side, that he'd changed sides because of what Saul was doing. And it wasn't difficult, I don't suppose, for David to persuade him that he'd decided enough was enough and he wasn't going to be chased around by this king. He was actually going to leave his service and join the Philistines and put all his energies to defeating the king who was seeking his death. We come into the next chapter. We'll come into that chapter in a moment. But just to think that although we get the impression that David was rushing around from here to there all the time, but he did get a period in his fleeing from Saul when he was settled, but he was settled in a foreign land. He had his men, but of course there would have been inhabitants of Ziklag. He wouldn't have been just his people who lived there. Um, uh, and once Ziklag became David's, when he became king, he took it with him into his kingdom, and it became part of the land of the kings of Judah. And David gave a very good impression of enlisting with the Philistines. He had to do expedient things. He managed to look as if he was an enemy of his own people, but he actually did nothing treacherous against them. He trod a very fine line that at times was very risky, I imagine. But this settling in a town shows just really how important it is, even for everybody, to have a place where they settle, a place that they can call home. Being itinerant all the time, it suits some people's, but for every one of them, there is a period of settlement wherever they go. And I think that speaks to me, as I'm thinking about it, about churches. There are people who, I don't know, they're affectionately called Christian nomads or Christian gypsies, not meaning any disparagement to gypsies, but because there are people who never settle for any length of time in any one church. They will settle for a while, and then when the novelty has worn off and they discover things they don't quite agree with, or they don't quite like, or they perhaps have a moment when they disagree with something a preacher says, and then they're off and they go and find another church. And I think that shows the difficulty some people have in submitting to leadership. As we discussed before, submission only becomes an issue when you don't agree with the people you're meant to submit to. And as long as what the leadership are doing is not anti-Christ and is not anti the Bible, it is not against the principles of the Bible, then there is a place for those who belong to the body of Christ to submit to the leadership within it. And to, just like in a family, you don't up and leave a family when there's a disagreement. You stay in the family because you belong. And there's a sense in which every one of us should belong to a fellowship of believers. And we should belong, and when the issue of disagreement comes up, we should deal with it in a different way to get it to walking out and going somewhere else. So that's my thoughts. So we'll tomorrow, I think we will we will be looking at chapter 28. Do read chapter 28 in the meantime, and God bless you. And it'll be the weekend tomorrow. It'll be Saturday. How did it get to being Friday again? That's what we say every day, Terry and I. How did it get to being Friday? Anyway, and we're in at the end of the Olympics. All that excitement will be gone, and next week we'll be into ordinary days again and winding down for autumn. Dear, oh dear. Anyway, enough. My time is up, and I wish you God's blessing for the day. Bye-bye.